Hello everyone, my name is Roger Fari and I would like to welcome you to this video. In this video we are going to learn about another form of functions in Python. These types of functions are named or are called Lambda functions. Lambda functions is basically a function expressed in one line. In this video we are going to see how we can create these types of functions and in what situations these types of functions will be useful in our journey of learning about programming, then later on using it in data analytics. Alright, let's look at the video. Okay, so like I said, Lambda functions are functions in one line, right? So a regular syntax of a function, if you remember in the previous video that we talked about that, is basically you say define and then uses your function name and you've got your input arguments. We did see there are different types of the input arguments. We can have more than one. We can have arbitrary. We can have arbitrary with parameters. So there are a lot of types of input arguments with regular function expression, function syntax, and then you've got as many expressions as you want. I don't know, printing, copying, multiplication, whatever it is that you need to do in your function, you can have as many lines as you want. In contrast, Lambda function is just one line, right? So you say Lambda and then you create your input arguments. So you say this is X, Y, Z, or like my input 1, my input 2, whatever it is. So your input arguments and then your expression. Pay attention, Lambda function does not have a name like function. You don't create a name for the function. So let's look at an example. A regular function would be something like this. For instance, when I create a function called square, which basically results in the square of an inputted number. So I'm gonna call it square, and then it takes n, a number, and then it return n power to 2, right? So once I create this function, right, so now I can say, for instance, square of 5, and it's 25, the square of 9, 81, right? So on and so forth. How would this function look like in terms of Lambda? It would be something like this. So I'm going to call it my Lambda, right? So it would be Lambda n, right? Input argument. So we only have one, n, then expression, return, whatever it is that we want to return, n power to 2, right? So you see it's much more concise way of creating the same function, right? So now once we run this, you can use my Lambda exactly like a function. So my Lambda 5, right, it gives the same answer. Okay, so that's how we create Lambda functions. Next, we're going to talk about so what when we can create functions in one line of code. There are two major applications that you may be able to use when in situations like that, you could derive value from Lambda functions. One of them is, remember in the previous video, we talked about mapping a function to a collection. And sometimes we have to before getting to that line of code, mapping that function, we have to think and create our function first and then come to this mapping line of code. But with Lambda function, you can create a function on the fly, right? You can, once you say list map, create your function, and then assign the collections that you want the functions to be applied to. So that's one way that Lambda functions are very useful. The second type and the second situations that Lambda functions are very useful is when the outcome of a function, you need to be a function, right? So you want to have a master function that gets some inputs and create a more customized function, right? So let's look at these two examples. So for the first example, you want to create a function on the fly when you are applying to a collection. when you're mapping it to a collection. So for instance, let us create a list. So my list, let's use a list comprehension for I in range, let's say from 2 to 10, right? So now I can say list map, and on the fly create this function that wants to square these values. So I would be saying lambda x, so my input x power to 2, and then I would pass my list, right? As simple as that. You see, on the fly I created a function and I applied it to this list. So that's one of the ways that lambda function can be very useful. The second usage is perhaps a little bit more advanced. It's good for us to learn it here, but I would doubt that anytime soon you're going to be needing this second way you can use lambda functions. But the first application is going to be very useful once you start using programming for analytics and data analytics. So let's create an example. So for instance, instead of having a function that results in the power to 2 of the number, or like square the number, let's create a function that return the power to n, right? It returns a function that allows us to power to n, right? So here I'm going to return a lambda function. You see, I'm returning a function, and it's going to be x power to n. Pay attention. So the input of this function is going to be using the expression of the lambda function. So now, once I create this function, now I can have a function that outputs a function, right? So it's outputting a lambda function. So I can grab this, I can call this power to 3, right? And this is a function, right? And then use this power to 3, which is a function, to calculate, 3 power to 3, which is 27. So you can see that we were able to create a function that is a master function, then it outputs a more customized function. Like I said, for the most part, we're going to be using this applications of lambda function, but also you want to know that this is also possible. All right, so let's talk about cases that we may have more than one input number, right? So here we only had one input for our lambda function. How about if we needed more than one input? So for instance, let's say we want to create a function that is going to be mapped to these two lists, right? So the first list is numbers from 1 to 9, and the second list are the numbers from 21 to 29. So I want to map a function that results the power of the members in nums, the first list, to the numbers on nums2, right? So I'm going to create this function lambda x and y. Pay attention, now I've got x and y, two input arguments, and then I would say x power to y, and now I pass my lists. You can see now my lambda function has more than 2 input arguments. It can be 3, as many as you want, right? So let's run this, and you can see that you've got 1 power to 21, and then you've got 2 power to 22, and then you got 3 power to 23, and so on and so forth. These are the values. All right. And there is another way you can use lambda function, is you can also use lambda function for arbitrary inputs, right? So let's imagine we have 3 of these stuff, right? So we've got this and another, and we've got 3 lists. This time it's gonna be from 41 to 50, right? Let's call this num3. And this time we want to create a list from using a map that is going to use an arbitrary input, right? So for arbitrary input we need a star, and we say n, right? And then we want to sum up this value, and 0 and 1, we want to sum them up, plus and 2, right? And then once the function is created, we pass these lists, nums, and then nums2 and nums3, right? And nums3. So once we run this, now we are summing up the values of these three lists by order. So the first one is going to be the summation of 1 plus 21 plus 41. The second one is going to be summation of 2 plus 22 plus 42, and so on and so forth. You can see we are using this arbitrary input of Python. Pay attention, we cannot use double star, because in that case we would need to be using a parameterized inputs, and the Lambda function does not support that. I think we're going to learn this video. We're going to learn to see how we can combine lambdas and conditionals. Specifically, what if the function that we want to write needs a conditional, right? Do you remember we wrote this function that would get us the 2 digits of day strings. So if our string value, if our day value was from 1 to 10, we wanted the function to output 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3 as a string. If it was larger than 10, the same number as a string, 10, 11, 12, right? So do you remember that? We had this function and we want this function to be applied to a collection. So here, right, so if I have my day as 2, this is going to return 0, 2. If my day is 11, or has 2 digits, it's going just to be itself in a form of string. So for this we had to create a conditional, right? So if n is smaller than 10, then do something, and if not, then do another thing. So we needed a conditional to be able to do this. How about if we wanted to have a lambda function in this situation? So in this situation, if you wanted to have a lambda function, this is how we could go about this. So the syntax is here. Lambda input, then true expression, if the Boolean logic, else the false expression. True expression is the expression you want to run if the logic is true, and the expression you want to run if the logic is false, right? So I would write something like this. My lambda, right, is equal to lambda n. So if it's true, I want to return str string of n. If n is larger than or equal to 10, else I want to return this. Pay attention, just for practice, I swapped if and else. Here this is an expression under if, but here is an expression under else, which doesn't matter. If you wanted to switch that around, you have to also change this, so this would work out. But anyway, once you create this, now you can rely on this my lambda to do the same thing for you, right? So if you get 2, you will have 0, 2s. Anything above that, you will have that. So we could use this to apply this to a list. So let's see. For instance, we've got days, my list of days from 1 I in range, for I in range 1 to 32, right? And then I want to list this mapping that I'm going to use this lambda function, right? So imagine I'm creating this on the fly. right? And I wanna map that to base. So once I run this gives me what we're looking for. I could have just used my lambda, right? Wouldn't have mattered at all, or I could have just used this function. Either way, the point here is we have options in creating functions. It can be a lambda function, it can be an explicit or regular function. And the advantages of lambda function versus regular functions, as far as computational costs, they're not that much different. But in situations that you can have a really quick lambda function, on the fly, you can do it. Maybe one conditional. It might be better when you are mapping a function to a collection to use lambda function. But if your function is perhaps more complex, have more than one conditional. It's not that you cannot create lambda function with more than one conditional, but it kind of defeats the purpose of lambda function because your code becomes basically very hard to read, and it might be hard actually to create as well. So this is a rule of thumb. If your code is, your function is easy to write in one line of code using lambda, and it has at most one conditional, and you are mapping that function to a list, it might be a good idea to write that on the fly. All right.